I paid their bills, their rent, their life. Yet when I fell sick, they said they couldn't miss their cruise. Those words cut deeper than any illness ever could. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 72 years old. For 50 years, I've lived in this cramped one-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, watching the city change through my kitchen window while my life remained frozen in the same pattern of giving, hoping, and being forgotten. The radiator clanks every morning at 5:30, the same sound that's greeted me for decades. The smell of coffee from the deli downstairs used to comfort me. Now it just reminds me of all the mornings I woke up alone, planning how to make everyone else's life easier. That morning 3 months ago started like any other. The fever had been building for days, my body aching in ways that scared me. At 72, you know when something isn't right. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, the screen blurry through my tears and exhaustion. I typed the message with trembling fingers. "Sarah, I'm really sick. Can you come? I'm scared." The response came 2 hours later, casual and cold. "Sorry, Mom, can't make it. The cruise leaves tomorrow. We've been planning this for months. Maybe next time. Feel better? Maybe next time." As if my illness was an inconvenience, a dental appointment that could be rescheduled. I stared at those words until they burned into my memory, sitting in my worn armchair that faces the window overlooking 3rd Avenue. The morning light felt harsh against my feverish skin, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to feel truly abandoned. But let me go back. Let me tell you how I got here, to this moment of devastating clarity. Let me tell you about the decades of sacrifice, the years of putting everyone else first, and the slow, painful realization that I had been buying love with pieces of my soul. It started in 1974, the year my husband Richard lost his job at the construction company. I remember the night he came home, his work boots heavy on our apartment stairs, his face gray with shame. "Maggie," he said, using the nickname that once made me feel cherished. "They let me go. Budget cuts." I held him while he cried, his big shoulders shaking against my chest. That night, looking at our 2 children sleeping in their shared bedroom, I made a promise to myself that would define the next 50 years of my life. I would be the one to keep us afloat. I would be the rock. The next morning, I took a second job cleaning offices in Midtown. My days stretched from 6 in the morning to 10 at night, riding the subway with cleaning supplies and a determination that felt noble then, foolish now. Richard tried to find work, but the 70s were hard in New York, so I carried us. I paid the rent on our small apartment in Queens, bought the groceries, covered the utilities, and smiled when the children asked for things we couldn't afford. "Mom, you don't have to do everything," my son Michael said once, when he was 16 and watching me count change for his school lunch money. I ruffled his dark hair and told him that's what mothers do. I believed it then. I thought I was building something beautiful, a family held together by unconditional love and sacrifice. Sarah was different from Michael, even as a child. Where he worried about my long hours, she expected them. When she turned 18 and wanted to go to college, I emptied my savings account without hesitation. $40,000, my entire emergency fund, gone in 1 semester to pay for her apartment near NYU and her tuition. "I'll pay you back, Mom," she promised, her young face bright with possibility. "When I graduate, when I get my job in marketing, I'll pay you back everything." I never saw a penny of that money again, but I kept giving. When Michael got married and needed a deposit for his apartment in Brooklyn, I gave him $12,000. When Sarah graduated and couldn't find work immediately, I paid her rent for 8 months. When Richard's back gave out and he needed physical therapy our insurance wouldn't cover, I worked overtime at both my jobs and paid for every session. The pattern was set. I became the family bank, the emergency fund, the solution to every problem. And slowly, imperceptibly, I stopped being seen as anything else. The requests came in text messages, phone calls that started with small talk and ended with financial needs. "Mom, the car needs repairs." "Mom, the daycare raised their prices." "Mom, we're a little short this month." Never, "How are you, Mom?" Never, "What do you need?" Just the assumption that I would provide, that I would say yes, that I would somehow find the money. And I always did. I worked 3 jobs in my 60s, cleaning houses in the morning, working at a grocery store in the afternoon, and doing bookkeeping for a small business in the evenings. My arthritis screamed in protest. My feet swelled in shoes that had long since lost their shape. But I kept going. I ate canned soup and day-old bread so I could send Sarah $2,000 for her wedding. I wore the same winter coat for 15 years so Michael's children could have nice Christmas presents. The signs were always there, weren't they? I see them now with the clarity that only comes from pain. The way Sarah would answer my calls with a distracted, "What's up?" instead of, "Hi, Mom." The way Michael would cut our conversations short when I started talking about my day. The way they both seemed surprised when I mentioned my birthday approaching, as if it was an inconvenience they'd forgotten. I remember Sarah's wedding in 2018. I had worked extra shifts for months to pay for her dress, the photographer, the flowers. I arrived at the venue in my best outfit, a navy blue dress I'd bought from the thrift store and spent hours altering, only to find that no table had been assigned for me. "Oh, Mom," Sarah said when I found her in a panic of last-minute preparations. "We thought you'd want to help in the kitchen instead of sitting." Help in the kitchen at my daughter's wedding. While her friends and new in-laws danced and celebrated, I washed dishes in the back, my arthritic hands raw in the industrial soapy water. But even then, I told myself it was love. I told myself that service was my love language, that providing was my purpose. I was still buying into the lie that my value was measured by what I could give, not who I was. The 70th birthday that no one remembered should have been my wake-up call. I had dropped hints for weeks, mentioning the date in conversations, talking about how different decades felt when you reached them. The day came and went without a call, a text, a card. I sat in my apartment eating a cupcake I'd bought for myself from the corner bodega, watching the sunset over Manhattan, and felt a loneliness so profound it took my breath away. When Sarah finally called 3 days later, chattering about her new job promotion, I mentioned it was my birthday weekend. "Oh my God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I've been so busy. We should celebrate soon." But soon never came. It never does it? The health problems started getting worse last year. My high blood pressure, the arthritis in my hands and knees, the persistent cough that wouldn't go away. When I mentioned these things to my family, the response was always the same. "You should see a doctor, Mom." Easy enough to say when you're not the one rationing medication because Medicare doesn't cover everything, and your children assume you have unlimited resources. I started going to the community health center in East Harlem, where sliding scale fees meant I could afford basic care. The nurses there were kind, patient with my questions and fears. They knew my name, asked about my week, remembered details about my life. It struck me how strange it felt to be seen, to be treated with simple human dignity. But my family? They were always too busy for the details of my declining health, too focused on their own lives to notice that the woman who had held them up for decades was starting to crumble. The credit card incident should have been the final straw. I discovered it by accident, checking my bank statement online. Something I'd started doing religiously as my fixed income got tighter. There it was, a charge for $850 at an upscale department store in Soho. I called the bank, thinking it was fraud, only to learn that Sarah had been added to my account years ago for emergencies and had used the card. When I called her about it, her response was casual, dismissive. "Mom, I needed a new winter coat and some work clothes. I've been meaning to tell you. I'll pay you back when I get my tax refund." That was 6 months ago. The tax refund came and went, spent on a vacation to Miami that she posted all over social media while I ate generic cereal for dinner and wondered how I'd make rent that month. But here's the thing about being taken advantage of for so long. You start to doubt your own perception. You start to wonder if you're being unreasonable, if you're asking for too much. Maybe children don't always remember birthdays. Maybe they're too busy with their own lives to check on aging parents. Maybe I was being selfish to want acknowledgement, appreciation, basic consideration. The manipulation was subtle, but constant. When I tried to express hurt about being forgotten or taken for granted, the response was always the same emotional pattern. First, denial. "That's not what happened, Mom." Then, minimization. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." Then guilt. "After everything we've been through as a family, I can't believe you'd say that." And finally, the killing blow. "If you really loved us, you'd understand how hard things are for us right now." If you really loved us, those words were used to justify everything. If I really loved them, I'd understand why they couldn't visit when I was sick. If I really loved them, I'd keep sending money without questions. If I really loved them, I'd stop being dramatic about wanting basic respect and consideration. I started seeing a therapist at the community center, a kind woman named Dr. Rodriguez, who specialized in working with older adults. It took me 6 sessions to even admit out loud that I felt used. The words felt like a betrayal, like I was violating some sacred rule of motherhood by acknowledging that my children were taking advantage of me. "Margaret," Dr. Rodriguez said during one of our sessions, "what would you tell a friend who was in your situation?" The question stopped me cold. What would I tell a friend whose children only called when they needed money, who forgot her birthday, who disappeared when she needed support. I would be outraged on her behalf. I would tell her she deserved better. I would encourage her to set boundaries, to demand respect, to stop enabling their behavior. But applying that same logic to my own life felt impossible. Because if I stopped being the provider, the emergency fund, the constant giver, who would I be to them? What if admitting I felt used led to losing them entirely? The night I got Sarah's cruise text, burning with fever and shaking with hurt, I called my son, Michael. Surely he would come, would show the concern that his sister couldn't muster. The phone rang 5 times before he answered, and I could hear the sounds of a restaurant in the background. Mom? This isn't a great time. We're at dinner with friends. What's going on? I'm really sick, honey. I've had a fever for 3 days and I'm scared. Could you come over, maybe bring some soup? There was a pause. The sound of muffled conversation, probably him explaining to his wife why his sick mother was interrupting their social evening. Mom? I'm sure it's just a bug. Take some Tylenol and get some rest. I'll try to call you tomorrow. Try to call me tomorrow, not, I'll be right over. Not, let me bring you to urgent care. Not even, I'll call you in a few hours to check on you. Try to call tomorrow, like I was a customer service complaint he'd get around to when convenient. That night, alone and feverish in my small apartment, listening to the sirens and traffic of the city that never sleeps, I had what Dr. Rodriguez would later call my breaking point. I looked around at the photos covering my walls, decades of family memories, birthday parties I'd paid for, graduations I'd celebrated, weddings I'd funded, and I realized something that changed everything. In almost every photo, I was the one taking the picture. I was there for every important moment, but I wasn't in the moments. I was documenting their lives, funding their dreams, facilitating their happiness, but I wasn't actually part of their world. I was a service provider with a biological connection, valued for what I could do, not who I was. The next morning, still weak but no longer willing to be invisible, I made a decision that terrified me. When my phone buzzed with a text from Michael asking if I could lend him $1,500 for car repairs, I typed 2 letters that felt revolutionary. No. Not, I can't right now. Not, let me see what I can do. Just, no. His response came immediately. What do you mean, no? Mom, I really need this. The car won't start and I have to get to work. No, I typed again. Figure it out another way. The phone rang within minutes. Michael's voice was a mixture of confusion and irritation. Mom, what's going on? This isn't like you. Are you feeling okay? The irony was staggering. He was more concerned about my mental health when I stopped giving him money than he'd been about my physical health when I was sick and alone. That was the beginning of my awakening, but it was just the beginning. Saying no to one financial request didn't undo 50 years of conditioning, 50 years of believing that my worth was tied to my usefulness, but it was a crack in the foundation, and cracks have a way of spreading. I started small. When Sarah called asking me to babysit her neighbor's children so she could earn extra money dog sitting, I said I had other plans. When Richard asked me to drive him to his doctor's appointment across town because it was too expensive to take a taxi, I suggested he call a medical transport service. When Michael's wife sent a group text asking family members to contribute to their anniversary party expenses, I didn't respond. You would have thought I'd declared war. The family response was swift and coordinated, a campaign designed to bring me back in line. Sarah showed up at my apartment unannounced, her face a mask of concern that didn't reach her eyes. Mom, Michael told me you're acting strange. Not wanting to help with things, being difficult. Are you depressed? Maybe we should talk to your doctor about medication. There it was. The instant pathologizing of my refusal to be taken advantage of. I wasn't setting healthy boundaries. I was mentally unstable. I wasn't demanding respect. I was being difficult. I'm fine, Sarah, I said, standing in my doorway and not inviting her in. I'm just tired of being an ATM instead of a mother. Her face changed then, the fake concern dropping away to reveal something harder underneath. That's not fair, Mom. We love you. We appreciate everything you do. But you know we're struggling right now. The economy is terrible and we're doing our best. If you can't help us anymore, just say so instead of making us feel guilty. Making them feel guilty. The audacity was breathtaking. 50 years of guilt trips about loving them enough to sacrifice everything, and now I was the one making them feel guilty by refusing to be exploited. Richard's response was different but equally manipulative. He showed up for what he called a family meeting, sitting heavily in my living room chair and looking at me with disappointment. Maggie, I don't know what's gotten into you. This isn't the woman I married. We're supposed to be a team, supposed to help each other. Now you're being selfish, turning your back on your own family when they need you most. Selfish. That word hit like a physical blow. After 5 decades of selflessness, of putting everyone else's needs before my own, of working myself to exhaustion to fund other people's dreams, I was selfish for wanting basic consideration and respect. But something interesting happened during these confrontations. Instead of the familiar shame and desperate need to fix things, I felt calm. Sad, yes, but calm. Dr. Rodriguez had been preparing me for this, helping me understand that their manipulation was predictable, that their anger was really about losing control over their cash source, not about losing me as a person. "Richard," I said quietly, "when was the last time you asked me how I was feeling? Not when you needed something, not when you wanted me to do something, but just because you cared about my well-being?" He stared at me, his mouth working but no words coming out. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of decades of one-sided caring. "That's what I thought," I continued. "You don't want a partner, Richard. You want a provider. You don't want a wife. You want a service." The family campaign intensified after that conversation. Michael started sending his children to guilt me. My grandchildren, ages 8 and 12, showing up at my door with handmade cards about how much they missed me, how sad they were that I didn't want to help their family anymore. Using children as emotional weapons, it was a new low, even for them. But I held firm. I started attending a support group at the senior center, where I met other women who had similar stories. There was Rosa, whose adult children had used her Social Security checks to pay their own bills while she struggled to afford her medications. There was Janet, whose son had moved back home temporarily 15 years ago and now treated her like hired help in her own house. There was Beverly, whose daughter had taken out credit cards in her name and destroyed her credit score. We called ourselves the ATM Recovery Group, and we met every Thursday at 2 o'clock in the center's community room. We shared stories, supported each other through family guilt trips, and slowly learned to value ourselves as more than just sources of financial and emotional labor. It was Rosa who suggested I change my banking passwords and remove my children's access to my accounts. "Mija," she said in her gentle Puerto Rican accent, "you can't set boundaries with people who have the keys to your wallet." That afternoon, I walked to the bank branch on Lexington Avenue and had what felt like the most empowering conversation of my life. I removed Sarah and Michael as authorized users on my credit cards, changed my banking passwords, and set up additional security measures. The young banker helping me was professional, but curious. "Mrs. Collins," she said carefully, "is everything okay? These are pretty significant changes." "Everything is perfect," I told her, and meant it. "I'm just learning to value myself." The real test came 6 weeks later, when Sarah announced her family was planning a cruise to the Caribbean. "It's been such a hard year, Mom. Tom got that promotion, and we finally feel like we can afford a real vacation. The kids are so excited." She didn't ask for money directly, but the implication was clear. In the past, I would have offered to help with expenses, maybe pay for the kids' airfare or contribute to their excursion fund. Instead, I said, "That sounds lovely. I hope you have a wonderful time." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. That's it?" Sarah finally asked. "Don't you want to help make this trip special for your grandchildren?" "I want you to make it special for them with your own money," I replied. 2 weeks later, I woke up with the fever. By the 3rd day, my body aching and my breathing labored, I was genuinely frightened. At 72, you don't take chances with illness. That's when I sent the text to Sarah, asking her to come, needing my daughter to show up when her mother was scared and sick. "Sorry, Mom, can't make it. The cruise leaves tomorrow." Those words crystallized everything. Not, "Let me see if Tom can take the kids and I'll come help you." Not, "Can we postpone for a day to make sure you're okay?" Just, "Can't make it." Like I was asking her to help me move furniture, not seeking comfort and care while potentially seriously ill. I called Michael next, with the same result. Then Richard, who was visiting his sister in New Jersey and couldn't really leave right now. In the span of 2 hours, every person I had supported, funded, and sacrificed for over the decades proved that I was valued only for what I could provide, not who I was. That night, shivering and alone in my apartment, I made another life-changing decision. I called 911. The paramedics who responded were more concerned about my well-being than my own family had been. They took my vital signs, asked detailed questions about my symptoms, and recommended I go to the hospital for evaluation. "Ma'am," the younger one said as they prepared to transport me, "do you have someone who can meet you there?" "No," I said, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a tragedy. It felt like clarity. I spent 2 nights in Mount Sinai Hospital with pneumonia, receiving IV antibiotics and breathing treatments. The nurses were kind, the doctors were thorough, and not once did anyone ask what I could do for them. They saw me as a person deserving of care, not as a resource to be extracted from. My family didn't know I was in the hospital. I didn't call them. And you know what? For the first time in years, I had peace. No requests for money, no guilt trips about not doing enough, no emotional manipulation, just quiet recovery and the strange comfort of being invisible to people who had never really seen me anyway. I was released on a Thursday afternoon with prescriptions and follow-up instructions. Taking a taxi back to my apartment, watching the familiar streets of Manhattan roll by, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, the possibility of a different life. That evening, I did something revolutionary. I ordered dinner from a nice restaurant, not because it was someone's birthday or a special occasion, just because I wanted good food and I deserved it. I bought myself flowers from the corner bodega. I ran a hot bath and soaked until the water grew cold. For the first time in my adult life, I treated myself with the same care I had always shown others. The family outrage came the next day when they realized I hadn't been answering calls or texts. Sarah showed up first, using the spare key I'd forgotten she had, finding me reading quietly in my living room. "Mom, where have you been? We've been calling and texting. Michael drove over yesterday and you weren't here. We were worried something happened to you." I looked at her for a long moment. This daughter I had raised and supported and loved unconditionally, and realized she was more concerned about not being able to reach me than about my actual well-being. "Something did happen to me," I said calmly. "I had pneumonia. I was in the hospital for 2 days." Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, concern, then defensiveness. "Why didn't you call us? We would have come to the hospital. We would have helped." "Would you?" I asked. "Because 3 days before I was hospitalized, I texted you that I was sick and needed help, and you told me you couldn't miss your cruise." The silence that followed was thick with decades of unspoken truths. Sarah's mouth opened and closed, her mind clearly working to find some way to deflect responsibility, to make this my fault somehow. That's different, Mom. You didn't say you were sick enough for the hospital. You just said you were sick. People get sick all the time. How are we supposed to know it was serious?" How are they supposed to know? Maybe by caring enough to check. Maybe by understanding that when a 72-year-old woman says she's sick and scared, it deserves more attention than a casual dismissal. Maybe by remembering that I had never, in 5 decades, asked them for help unless I truly needed it. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I said something that changed everything. "Sarah, I need you to give me back my spare key." The shock on her face was almost comical. "What? Why?" "Because I'm setting boundaries. Because I'm tired of being taken for granted. Because I want people in my life who value me, not just what I can provide." That conversation set off what I came to think of as the family avalanche. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with calls and texts from Richard, Michael, his wife, even Richard's sister in New Jersey. The message was consistent. I was overreacting, being dramatic, hurting the family over nothing. But buried in their panicked responses was the truth. They were terrified of losing their financial safety net, not of losing me. Michael arrived that evening with his wife and children, a coordinated emotional assault designed to break my resolve. The kids hugged me and told me they missed me, which broke my heart but didn't change my mind. His wife, Linda, tried a different approach. "Mom Collins," she said, settling onto my couch like we were having a friendly chat. "I think there's been some misunderstanding here. We all love you so much, and we're so grateful for everything you do for us. I know things have been stressful, but that's what family is for. Helping each other through tough times. Helping each other." The phrase would have been laughable if it hadn't been so painful. When had they helped me through tough times? When had anyone in this family asked what I needed? Offered support without being asked? Shown up when things were difficult for me? "Linda," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions in my chest. "In the 15 years you've been part of this family, can you name one time when you or Michael did something for me without me asking first?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Linda's composed expression flickered, her eyes darting to Michael for support. "That's not fair, Mom." Michael jumped in. "We didn't know you needed help. You never asked for anything. You always seemed so independent, so capable of handling everything yourself." There it was. The perfect circular logic of emotional manipulation. I was simultaneously expected to provide unlimited help without being asked while being criticized for not explicitly asking for help myself. I was supposed to anticipate their needs while they remained oblivious to mine. "I was in the hospital for 2 days 2 weeks ago," I said quietly. "Neither of you called to check on me. Neither of you visited. Neither of you even knew I was gone. That tells me everything I need to know about how much you pay attention to my life." The family meeting that followed was probably the most honest conversation we'd had in decades. precisely because I was no longer trying to manage everyone's feelings or avoid conflict. Richard sat heavily in his chair, looking older than his 74 years. Michael paced by the window, his jaw tight with frustration. Linda kept glancing at her phone, probably calculating how this family drama was interfering with her evening plans. Sarah sat across from me, her face cycling through emotions like a slot machine. Mom, I understand you're upset about the cruise thing, but you have to understand, we had been planning this trip for months. We'd already paid for everything. The kids were so excited I couldn't just cancel at the last minute because you had a cold. A cold. Pneumonia that landed me in the hospital for 2 days was a cold in her version of events. Sarah, I said, looking directly at her, if Tom was sick and scared and asked you to come help him, would you have gone on that cruise? The answer was written all over her face before she spoke. Of course she would have canceled for her husband. Of course his needs would have taken priority over vacation plans. That's different, she stammered. How is it different? Because Tom is my husband, and you're strong, Mom. You've always been so strong. You've always handled everything. You didn't think I was worth the same consideration you'd show anyone else in your life. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Linda looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing she was anywhere else. Michael stopped pacing and stared at me with something that might have been recognition. Richard's shoulders sagged as if I'd voiced something he'd always known but never acknowledged. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Whether from genuine remorse or tactical manipulation, I couldn't tell anymore. That's not true, Mom. You're important to us. You're so important, we love you. But you don't respect me, I replied. And love without respect is just words. That's when Richard tried to regain control of the conversation, using the authority voice that had worked for decades of marriage. Margaret, that's enough. You're being cruel now, and it's not like you. We made mistakes, okay? We should have been more attentive when you were sick. But your family, you don't cut off family over hurt feelings. Hurt feelings. 50 years of one-sided sacrifice reduced to hurt feelings. Richard, I said, my voice carrying a strength I didn't know I possessed, what have you done for me? Not for the family, not for the household, but specifically for me? In the last 5 years? The question seemed to genuinely puzzle him. His brow furrowed as if he were trying to solve a complex math problem. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone in the room. We live together. I help with things around the house. You live in my apartment, Richard. Your name isn't on the lease. You don't pay rent. The things around the house you help with are your own dishes and laundry. What have you done for me? The conversation continued for 2 hours, circling through decades of accumulated resentments and unspoken truths. But the most revealing moment came when Linda, clearly frustrated with the emotional intensity, made an observation that crystallized everything. Mom Collins, I just don't understand what you want from us. We're all doing our best. We have our own families, our own problems, our own financial struggles. We can't all be as selfless as you've been. Some of us have to think about our own lives first. Our own lives first. There it was. The admission that my life, my needs, my well-being had never been the priority. I had been the selfless one, the giver, the one who thought about everyone else first. They were the ones who thought about their own lives first, which was apparently normal and acceptable, while my desire to matter was selfish and unreasonable. Linda, I said, standing up to signal that this conversation was over, you're absolutely right. You should think about your own lives first. And I'm going to start thinking about mine first, too. The family campaign that followed my boundary setting was relentless and creative. When direct confrontation didn't work, they tried isolation, excluding me from family group chats and gatherings, hoping I'd feel lonely enough to capitulate. When that failed, they tried recruitment, sending relatives and family friends to talk sense into me. My sister-in-law Martha, Richard's sister from New Jersey, called to tell me I was destroying the family over pride. Maggie, honey, I understand you feel unappreciated, but this is what families do. We help each other. You're going to regret this when you're alone in a nursing home someday. The nursing home threat was particularly revealing. The assumption that my value as a person was tied to my usefulness to them, and that without their conditional love, I'd end up abandoned and institutionalized. What they didn't seem to understand was that I was already alone. I'd been alone for years while surrounded by people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. But the most insidious manipulation came through the grandchildren. Michael started dropping them off at my apartment building, sending them up alone to knock on my door with messages about how sad they were that I didn't love their family anymore. 8-year-old Emma standing in my hallway with tears in her eyes, asking why I didn't want to see them anymore. These moments were the hardest. Looking at those innocent faces, Knowing their parents were using them as emotional weapons broke my heart in new ways every time. But I also knew that teaching them it was normal to manipulate people with guilt and emotional blackmail wasn't love. It was continuing the cycle that had trapped me for 50 years. I started having conversations with the kids that were age-appropriate but honest. Emma, I love you very much, but grown-ups sometimes need to have conversations about how we treat each other, and that's between me and your parents. You don't need to worry about that. Would you like some juice and cookies while we wait for them to pick you up? The manipulation reached its peak 2 months later, when Sarah organized what she called a family intervention. She arranged for everyone to meet at Michael's house in Brooklyn under the pretense of a birthday celebration for one of the grandchildren. I arrived to find not a party, but an ambush. They had prepared, clearly rehearsing their approach. Michael started with statistics about depression in elderly people and how isolation could lead to cognitive decline. Richard appealed to our marriage vows and the importance of family unity. Linda talked about the children's confusion and sadness. Sarah cried and talked about how much she missed our old relationship. But it was my brother-in-law, Tom, Sarah's husband, who revealed the true motivation behind this coordinated effort. Mom Collins, I know we haven't always been perfect, but you have to understand. We count on you. Our whole family structure is built around knowing you're there for us. Without that foundation, everything falls apart. There it was, the naked truth. I wasn't a family member. I was a foundation, a structure that held up their lives while being invisible and taken for granted. The foundation doesn't get appreciated until it cracks or threatens to collapse. Tom, I said, looking around the room at these people I had loved and supported for decades. What you're describing isn't family. It's exploitation with a biological connection. The intervention backfired spectacularly. Instead of guilt-tripping me back into compliance, it showed me exactly how orchestrated and calculated their manipulation had become. They had reduced me to a problem to be managed, a resource that was malfunctioning and needed to be brought back online. I left that meeting with absolute clarity about my situation and my choices. I also left with something else. Overhearing a conversation between Linda and Sarah in the kitchen that they didn't realize I could hear. This is ridiculous, Linda was saying. She's going to ruin everything out of spite. Michael asked his financial advisor about retirement planning without being able to count on his mother's help, and the numbers are terrifying. We might have to sell the house. I know, Sarah replied. Tom calculated how much she's given us over the years, and it's crazy money, like enough for a down payment on a bigger house money. If she keeps this up, we're going to have to completely restructure our finances. Crazy money. Down payment on a bigger house money. Decades of my sacrifice reduced to a financial calculation they might need to restructure around. Not once in that conversation did they express concern about me as a person, regret about how they'd treated me, or genuine desire to repair our relationship. It was entirely about the money. That overheard conversation was my moment of complete liberation. Any lingering guilt about setting boundaries, any remaining hope that they might genuinely change, evaporated. They had shown me exactly how they saw me, and I finally believed them. I stopped answering their calls. I stopped responding to their texts. When they showed up at my apartment, I didn't let them in. The woman who had spent 50 years being available at all times, who had never said no to a request or ignored a need, went completely silent. The silence was initially terrifying for me. I had defined myself through service to others for so long that I wasn't sure who I was without it. But slowly, in that quiet space, I started to rediscover parts of myself that had been buried under decades of self-sacrifice. I started reading again, not just the practical books about budgeting and caregiving that had filled my shelves, but novels and poetry and memoirs that fed my soul. I bought art supplies and started painting for the first time since high school. I joined a walking group that met in Central Park every morning, discovering muscles I'd forgotten I had, and lungs that could breathe without the constant weight of other people's problems. Most importantly, I started therapy with Dr. Rodriguez twice a week instead of once. We talked about trauma bonding, codependency, and the difference between loving someone and enabling them. We talked about the guilt that came with setting boundaries and why it felt so terrifying to stop being useful to people who had never valued me. Margaret, Dr. Rodriguez said during one of our sessions, what would happen if you stopped trying to earn love and started expecting it as your birthright? The question stopped me cold. I had never, in 72 years of life, considered that love might be something I deserved simply for existing, rather than something I had to continuously earn through service and sacrifice. 3 months into my new life, the family's panic reached a crescendo. They had exhausted their manipulative tactics and moved into what I now recognize as the extinction burst, the dramatic escalation that happens when people realize their control is slipping away permanently. Richard moved out of my apartment, claiming he couldn't live with someone who had become cold and selfish. He went to stay with Michael, turning my home into a battlefield by removing items that had been his, including the television we'd owned for 10 years and several pieces of furniture I'd paid for, but he'd claimed ownership of during better times. Sarah stopped all pretense of caring about my well-being and went for the throat. She sent a group text to extended family members, painting me as mentally unstable and possibly developing dementia. Mom has become completely unreasonable and is isolating herself from family who love her. We're worried about her mental state and think she might need professional evaluation. The cruelest blow came when they used my grandchildren as weapons one final time. Michael brought 8-year-old Emma and 12-year-old Jake to my apartment building and had them call me from the lobby, crying and asking why I didn't love them anymore, why I wouldn't let them come upstairs, why I was being mean to their parents. Standing in my apartment, listening to those children's voices through the intercom, children I had helped raise, had read bedtime stories to, had bought countless gifts for, I experienced a grief so profound it felt like physical pain. But I also experienced something else. The recognition that using children to emotionally manipulate someone is a form of abuse, and that protecting myself from that abuse was not just acceptable, but necessary. I pressed the intercom button and spoke directly to the children. Emma, Jake, I love you both very much. This situation is between me and your parents, and it's not your responsibility to fix it. Ask your daddy to take you home now, and maybe we can talk when you're older and can understand better. Then I turned off the intercom and wept for the innocence that was being stolen from those children, for the toxic patterns they were learning about relationships and manipulation, and for the grandmother-grandchildren bond that was being sacrificed on the altar of their parents' financial anxiety. But I held my boundary, even when it broke my heart. The breakthrough came 4 months later, in the most unexpected way. I had been shopping at the Key Food on East 79th Street, struggling with heavy grocery bags and my arthritis-affected hands, when a woman about my age approached me. "Excuse me, do you need help with those bags?" I looked up to see a striking woman with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, genuine concern in her dark eyes. Everything about her suggested someone who had lived an interesting life. The quality of her simple but well-cut clothing, the confidence in her posture, the way she made eye contact without looking away. "That's very kind," I said. "But I can manage." She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd received from someone in months. "I'm sure you can, but managing doesn't mean you have to do everything alone. I'm Rosa Martinez, and I help because I know what it's like to carry too much for too long." Something in her voice, the particular phrasing of "carry too much for too long," made me stop and really look at her. She had the same weariness around her eyes that I saw in my own mirror, the same invisible weight that comes from decades of putting everyone else first. "I'm Margaret," I said, allowing her to take one of my heavier bags. "And yes, I do know what it's like to carry too much for too long." That chance encounter in a grocery store led to coffee the next day, which led to daily walks in Carl Schurz Park, which led to the most honest friendship I'd ever experienced. Rosa had been where I was, sacrificing everything for ungrateful adult children, enabling their financial irresponsibility, accepting emotional crumbs in exchange for unconditional support. But Rosa had been working on boundaries for 3 years. She had already walked the path I was just beginning, and she became my guide through the wilderness of learning to value myself. "The hardest part," Rosa told me during one of our walks along the East River, "is accepting that some people will only love you for what you provide. And once you stop providing it, you discover whether there was ever any real love there at all." Rosa had discovered, like I was discovering, that the answer was often no. But she had also discovered something beautiful, that there were people in the world who could love you for who you were, not what you could do for them. People who saw you as a whole person deserving of respect and consideration. Through Rosa, I met Carmen, who volunteered at the senior center. Through Carmen, I met Eleanor, who taught watercolor classes at the community college. Through Eleanor, I met a whole community of women who had learned to value themselves, who had survived similar awakenings, who understood the particular grief that comes with realizing you've been taken advantage of by the people who were supposed to love you most. For the first time in my adult life, I had actual friends. Not people who needed things from me, not people who saw me as useful, but people who enjoyed my company and sought out my thoughts and opinions. Women who called to ask how I was feeling, who remembered the books I'd mentioned wanting to read, who invited me to movies and museum exhibitions and botanical garden walks. I started volunteering at a literacy program, teaching older adult immigrants to read English. The joy of seeing someone sound out their first complete sentence, the gratitude in their eyes when they mastered a difficult concept, reminded me what genuine appreciation looked like. These students saw me as a person who was helping them achieve their dreams, not as an ATM pretending to have feelings. 6 months after my family breakdown, I made another revolutionary decision. I started dating. At 72, after 48 years of marriage to a man who saw me as a service provider, the idea of romantic companionship seemed both impossible and terrifying. But Rosa encouraged me to try online dating through a senior-focused app, just to practice having conversations with men who didn't know my history of overgiving. I matched with David, a retired English teacher whose wife had passed away 2 years earlier. Our first meeting was coffee at a small cafe near the Metropolitan Museum, and I was so nervous I arrived 20 minutes early and spilled sugar all over the table while waiting. But David was kind, genuinely interested in my thoughts about books and art, and most remarkably, he paid for his own coffee without expecting me to take care of the check. We talked for 2 hours about travel and literature and grandchildren, and not once did he ask me for anything or make me feel like I needed to prove my worth. "Margaret," he said as we were preparing to leave, "I had a lovely time today. Would you like to go to the Frick collection with me next Saturday? They have a new exhibition I think you'd enjoy." Would I like to go? When was the last time someone had asked what I would like, what I would enjoy? The question was so foreign that I almost didn't know how to answer it. Dating David, if 2 coffee meetings and a museum visit could be called dating, taught me something profound about healthy relationships. He called when he said he would call. He showed up when he said he would show up. He asked about my day and listened to the answer. He talked about his own life without expecting me to fix his problems or manage his emotions. He also taught me about reciprocity. When I offered to pay for lunch during our second date, he declined politely but didn't seem offended by the offer. When he mentioned being nervous about a medical procedure, I offered to drive him and wait, and he accepted gratefully, but insisted on buying me dinner afterward as a thank you. This was what normal relationships looked like: mutual consideration, balanced giving and receiving, respect for each other's autonomy. The contrast with my family relationships was stark and painful, but also illuminating. Meanwhile, my family's campaign to bring me back under control had evolved into what I can only describe as a smear operation. Sarah had apparently told anyone who would listen that I was having a mental breakdown and had turned against the family. Several neighbors and family acquaintances approached me with expressions of concern, having been told that I was isolating myself due to depression or early dementia. The most hurtful incident came when Father Murphy, the elderly priest from St. Agnes Church, where I had attended Mass for 30 years, stopped me after Sunday service to express his concern about reports that I was struggling with family relationships and might benefit from counseling to help me remember the importance of forgiveness and family unity. The audacity was breathtaking. They had turned my decision to stop being financially exploited into a spiritual failing, enlisting my own priest to guilt me back into compliance. It was manipulation at a level so sophisticated and cruel that I almost had to admire its creativity. But something interesting happened during that conversation with Father Murphy. Instead of feeling ashamed or defensive, I felt amused. The situation was so absurd, the manipulation so transparent, that I started laughing right there in the church vestibule. "Father," I said between chuckles, "I appreciate your concern, but I think there's been some miscommunication about my situation. I haven't turned against my family. I've just learned to value myself as much as I value them." This was my moment of complete emotional freedom, standing in the church where I'd prayed for decades for the strength to keep giving more than I received, explaining to a priest that choosing self-respect over exploitation wasn't a spiritual crisis, but a spiritual awakening. The confrontation I had been dreading finally came 8 months after my boundary setting began. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and I had spent the holiday volunteering at a soup kitchen in East Harlem with Rosa and Carmen, feeling more grateful and purposeful than I had in any previous Thanksgiving, surrounded by family who saw me as a food supplier and cleanup crew. I returned to my apartment on Friday evening to find Sarah sitting in the hallway outside my door, looking haggard and desperate. Her usual polished appearance had been replaced by something raw and real: unwashed hair, wrinkled clothes, the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of thinking you can manipulate someone back into compliance and slowly realizing you can't. "Mom," she said, standing up as I approached with my keys, "we need to talk. Please. I've been sitting here for 2 hours." Every instinct I'd developed over 7 decades screamed at me to comfort her, to ask what was wrong, to invite her in and make tea and fix whatever problem had brought her to my door. But I had spent 8 months learning to recognize manipulation, even when it wore the mask of vulnerability. "Sarah," I said calmly, "you could have called and made an appointment to talk. Ambushing me at my door isn't respectful communication." "An appointment?" Her voice cracked with what seemed like genuine emotion. Mom, you're my mother, not my dentist. I shouldn't need an appointment to talk to you. When you've spent 8 months trying to manipulate me instead of having honest conversations, yes, you need an appointment. When you've used my grandchildren as emotional weapons and spread lies about my mental health, yes, you need to show respect for my boundaries. I unlocked my door, but didn't invite her in. We could have this conversation in the hallway, where she couldn't settle in and launch into a marathon manipulation session. Sarah's careful composure finally cracked completely. Mom, I'm pregnant. The words hit me like a physical blow. Another grandchild, a baby I should have been excited about, should have been planning to spoil and love. Instead, all I could think was, and here comes the financial manipulation. Congratulations, I said carefully. How far along are you? 4 months. We just found out it's a boy. She waited, clearly expecting some rush of grandmotherly excitement that would override my boundaries and bring me back into the family fold. When it didn't come, she continued, Mom, this baby, we weren't planning for this. Money is really tight. Tom's been looking for a new job, and with my maternity leave unpaid, there it was. Not, I wanted to share this happy news with you, or I was hoping you could be part of this baby's life. Straight to the financial need, with pregnancy as the leverage to make refusing seem heartless. Sarah, I said quietly, what do you want from me? I want my mother back. The words exploded out of her with such force that Mrs. Chen from across the hall opened her door to see what was happening. Sarah lowered her voice but continued with desperate intensity. I want the mom who would be excited about her new grandchild, who would want to help us figure out how to afford the things we need, who would care about her family's well-being. I am that mother, Sarah. But I'm also a person who deserves respect and consideration, and I've learned the difference between helping someone and enabling them. Enabling? Sarah's voice rose again. Mom, we're not drug addicts. We're a young family with real expenses and real struggles. We're not asking you to enable anything. We're asking for the support that families give each other. What support have you given me, Sarah? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. Mom, you never needed support. You never asked for anything. You were always so strong, so independent. We didn't know you wanted anything from us. I wanted to matter. I wanted to be seen as a person, not just as a resource. I wanted my feelings to be considered, my health to be important, my life to have value beyond what I could provide for others. Sarah started crying then, real tears, not the tactical crying I'd learned to recognize. Mom, you do matter. You matter so much. We love you so much. We didn't realize, I didn't understand. For a moment, looking at my pregnant daughter crying in the hallway, I felt the old familiar pull to comfort, to reassure, to make everything okay. But I also remembered Dr. Rodriguez's words. People who genuinely want to change don't need you to make it easy for them. They need you to hold your boundaries while they do the work. Sarah, I said gently, I love you too. But love isn't enough anymore. Respect, consideration, genuine care, those things matter too, and they can't be negotiated back into existence with pregnancy announcements or crisis situations. What do you want from us, Mom? What would it take for us to have a relationship again? Tell me what to do and I'll do it. The desperation in her voice was real, but so was the transactional thinking. Tell me what to do and I'll do it. As if genuine relationship change was a checklist item to be completed, a performance to be executed until things went back to the old normal. Sarah, I can't tell you how to respect me. That has to come from your own understanding that I'm a person deserving of basic consideration. I can't teach you how to value me. That has to come from your own recognition of my worth. But what does that mean practically? What does that look like? I took a deep breath, looking at this daughter I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, who was genuinely trying to understand something that should have been obvious, but had been trained out of her by decades of my own enabling. It means calling to ask how I'm doing without needing anything from me. It means remembering my birthday and showing up when I'm sick. It means treating me with the same consideration you'd show a friend. It means seeing me as a person with my own feelings, needs, and boundaries, instead of as a resource to be managed. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. I can do that. I want to do that. Then start. But don't expect me to go back to the old patterns while you're learning. Don't expect me to provide financial support while you practice treating me with respect. My boundaries aren't punishments. They're protection. That conversation in the hallway was the beginning of something new, though it would take months more to see if the change was genuine or just another manipulation strategy with better tactical awareness. But something had shifted in me during that exchange. For the first time in my adult life, I had been able to have a difficult conversation with my daughter without taking care of her emotions, without managing her reaction, without making her feelings my responsibility. I had spoken my truth calmly and clearly and let her handle her own response to it. It felt revolutionary. The next few months became a testing ground for Sarah's claimed desire to change, and to my surprise, some of the changes seemed genuine. She called every Sunday just to talk, without asking for anything. She sent me a birthday card a month early because she'd put it on her calendar and didn't want to forget. When I mentioned in passing that I'd been battling a persistent cough, she offered to bring me soup, not because I asked, but because she thought of it herself. The financial requests stopped entirely, which I found both encouraging and concerning. Encouraging because it suggested she was actually listening to my boundaries. Concerning because it might mean they had found other sources of money, or were simply building up to a bigger ask later. Michael's approach was different. Instead of Sarah's emotional appeals, he tried the practical route, scheduling what he called a family business meeting to discuss restructuring our financial relationships for everyone's benefit. I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a small cafe in Midtown, where we couldn't be interrupted by other family members, and where the public setting would encourage civilized conversation. Michael arrived with a folder full of papers, looking every inch the serious businessman he'd always wanted to be seen as. He'd prepared charts showing their family budget, projections of their expenses over the next 5 years, and what he called a family loan program that would formalize their financial requests and create a repayment schedule. "Mom," he said, spreading the papers across our small table like a presentation, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said regarding feeling taken advantage of. I think part of the problem is that our financial arrangements have been too informal. This creates a structure that protects everyone." I looked at his charts and graphs, his carefully calculated projections and payment schedules, and felt something between amusement and sadness. After 8 months of me trying to explain that I wanted to be valued as a person rather than an ATM, his solution was to make the ATM function more official. "Michael," I said, pushing the papers back toward him, "what do you think I've been trying to tell you all these months? That you want more formal arrangements? Better communication about financial expectations? Clear boundaries about what you're comfortable contributing to? No, honey. I've been trying to tell you that I don't want to be the family bank at all anymore. I want relationships based on love and mutual respect, not financial dependency." His face went through a series of expressions as he processed this information. Confusion, disbelief, something that might have been panic. "But Mom, the family has always... This is how we've always worked as a family unit. You help us when we need it, and you what, Michael?" The silence stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Michael stared at his papers, his mind clearly working to find some reciprocal benefit he provided that would justify the one-sided financial arrangement we'd had for decades. "We're your family," he finally said. "We love you. That should be enough." Should it? Because loving someone usually involves caring about their well-being, remembering their needs, showing up when they're struggling. When have you done any of those things for me? Michael's frustration finally showed. "Mom, this is manipulative. You're changing the rules of our relationship and making us feel guilty for accepting help you freely offered. That's not fair." Manipulative. I was manipulative for refusing to be manipulated anymore. "Michael," I said, gathering my purse to leave, "I offered help freely for decades. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being appreciated and started being expected. It stopped being help and became exploitation. I'm not changing the rules. I'm finally learning to play by rules that include my own value as a person." That conversation marked the end of my attempts to negotiate a middle ground with my family. Michael's inability to see me as anything other than a financial resource, his framing of my boundary setting as manipulation, his assumption that love alone should be enough to justify continued exploitation, it all crystallized my understanding that this wasn't a communication problem that could be solved with better conversations. This was a fundamental difference in how we saw my value as a person. Meanwhile, my new life was flourishing in ways I couldn't have imagined. My friendship with Rosa had deepened into something that felt like the sister relationship I'd always wanted. We traveled together. First just day trips to the Hudson Valley, then a long weekend in Boston, and finally a week-long trip to Santa Fe that I paid for, with money I would have previously spent on my family's emergencies. David and I had settled into what could actually be called a relationship. We saw each other twice a week, went to museums and concerts, cooked dinner together in his apartment sometimes, and mine other times. He had met Rosa and Carmen and integrated into my new social circle with genuine warmth. Most remarkably, he had never once asked me for money, assumed I would pay for his expenses, or treated me like a service provider with biological connections. The contrast was so stark, it was almost comical. Here was a man I'd known for less than a year treating me with more consistent consideration than my own family had shown in decades. But the real transformation was internal. Dr. Rodriguez and I had worked through layers of codependency, people-pleasing, and what she called learned helplessness in reverse, the condition where you become so accustomed to being needed that you don't know who you are if you're not rescuing someone. "Margaret," she said during one of our sessions, "what do you think would happen if you lived an entire month focusing only on your own needs and desires?" The question terrified me. An entire month without managing anyone else's emotions, solving anyone else's problems, providing anyone else's solutions? It seemed both impossible and selfish, but I tried it. I spent January focusing entirely on myself, reading books I wanted to read, eating food I enjoyed, going to bed early when I was tired, saying no to requests without providing alternatives. I painted watercolors of the city views from my apartment windows. I took a creative writing class at the senior center. I bought myself flowers every Tuesday just because they made me happy. And you know what happened? The world didn't end. My family didn't die from lack of my constant support. My friends didn't abandon me for being selfish. Instead, I discovered parts of myself that had been buried under decades of other people's needs. I remembered that I had opinions about art and politics and books. I rediscovered a sense of humor that wasn't based on deflecting conflict or managing other people's comfort. I became, for the first time in my adult life, a person I actually enjoyed spending time with. The final test came in March, 11 months after my boundary setting began. Sarah went into early labor at 36 weeks, and the baby, my 5th grandchild, was born requiring immediate NICU care. The phone call came from Michael at 2 in the morning. "Mom, Sarah's having the baby now. It's early and there are complications. We're at Mount Sinai. She's asking for you." Every cell in my body screamed at me to rush to the hospital, to drop everything and be there for this crisis, to resume my role as the family's emotional support system. But I had spent nearly a year learning to pause, to think, to consider my own needs alongside everyone else's. "How serious are the complications?" I asked. "The baby's in the NICU. Sarah's okay but scared. The doctors say the baby should be fine but needs to stay in the hospital for a few weeks. Tom's with her, but she wants her mother. She wants her mother, not the woman who had spent 8 months setting boundaries and refusing to be taken advantage of. Her mother, the old version of me who jumped at every crisis and made everyone else's problems my own. "I'll be there in the morning," I said, during visiting hours. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. "Mom, this is an emergency. Sarah is scared and needs you now. Can't you come tonight?" "Michael, I understand this is frightening, but showing up at 2 a.m. won't change the medical situation, and I'm not the person who handles everyone's emotions anymore. I'll be there tomorrow to meet my grandchild and support Sarah in practical ways." I hung up and sat in my dark apartment, listening to the sounds of the city that never sleeps, feeling the weight of the decision I'd just made. The old Margaret would have been dressed and in a taxi within 10 minutes. The new Margaret was learning that supporting someone didn't require abandoning yourself. I arrived at the hospital the next day with flowers for Sarah and a gift for the baby. A soft blanket I'd purchased, not because crisis demanded it, but because I wanted to welcome my new grandchild with love and intention. Sarah looked exhausted and emotional, her hair pulled back messily, her face pale but relieved. When she saw me walk into her room, she started crying. "Mom, you came." Of course I came. I wanted to meet my grandson. We spent an hour together, a real hour, focused on her experience of the birth, her fears about the baby's health, her hopes for his future. I listened without trying to fix anything, offered comfort without taking responsibility for her emotions, and provided support without enabling dependency. When she mentioned being worried about the NICU costs and how they'd manage financially with an extended hospital stay, I didn't immediately offer to solve the problem. Instead, I said, "That sounds stressful. Have you talked to the hospital's financial counselor about payment plans?" The old Sarah would have exploded at that response, would have accused me of being heartless for not immediately writing a check. But this Sarah, whether because she genuinely learned something or because she recognized that financial manipulation would end our relationship entirely, just nodded. "Tom's meeting with someone tomorrow to discuss options. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. Not, can you help us figure it out? Not, we're counting on you to solve this. Just acknowledgement that this was their problem to solve, their responsibility to handle. It felt like a miracle. I stayed with them for 2 hours, met little Benjamin in the NICU, held his tiny hand through the openings in his incubator, and felt the complicated joy of loving someone while maintaining boundaries with their parents. Walking out of that hospital, I realized something profound. I could love my family and maintain my self-respect at the same time. I could be a grandmother without being a bank account. I could provide emotional support without accepting emotional manipulation. The real transformation wasn't just in me, it was in them. Faced with my consistent boundaries over nearly a year, forced to handle their problems without my constant intervention, they had slowly started to develop the independence and problem-solving skills that my decades of enabling had stunted. Richard, who had been staying with Michael since moving out of my apartment, found his own senior housing and started receiving Social Security benefits he'd been eligible for, but never pursued because my support made it unnecessary. Michael and Linda downsized to a smaller apartment and created a realistic budget that didn't include financial assistance from extended family. Sarah and Tom started using community resources, food banks, sliding-scale medical care, financial counseling services, instead of treating me as their personal social safety net. Were they happier with this arrangement? Probably not. But they were more capable, more self-sufficient, and dealing with me as a person rather than a resource. The final piece of my transformation came in May, exactly 1 year after my boundary setting began. David asked me to go with him to visit his daughter in California for a week, and for the first time in my adult life, I said yes to a trip purely for pleasure without worrying about who might need me while I was gone. We stayed in San Diego, where his daughter Lisa lived with her husband and 2 teenagers. Lisa treated me with the automatic respect that David had taught me to expect. She asked about my interests, included me in conversations, thanked me genuinely for small kindnesses without making them seem obligatory. Most remarkably, when David mentioned that he'd been helping Lisa's family with some home repairs and had probably overextended himself physically, both Lisa and her husband immediately insisted that he rest and offered to find alternative solutions. When someone they cared about indicated they had limits, their response was consideration and concern, not manipulation and demanding. This was what healthy family relationships looked like. On our last evening in San Diego, sitting on the deck of Lisa's house watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, David took my hand and said something that crystallized everything I'd learned over the past year. "Margaret, I hope you know how much you've changed my life. Not by doing things for me or solving my problems, but just by being exactly who you are. You're remarkable, and I'm grateful that you let me see you. Let me see you. Not use you, need you, depend on you. See you." I started crying right there on that deck, overwhelmed by the simplicity and power of being valued for who I was, rather than what I could provide. That trip marked the official end of my old life, and the beginning of something entirely new. I returned to New York with a confidence I'd never felt before, a sense of my own worth that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or need. My family relationships had stabilized into something that wasn't the warm closeness I'd once dreamed of, but wasn't the toxic exploitation it had been either. Sarah called regularly just to talk, sharing updates about Benjamin's growth and asking about my life with what seemed like genuine interest. Michael and I had brief but pleasant conversations about his work and my volunteer activities. Richard and I maintained polite distance, seeing each other occasionally at grandchildren's events but no longer pretending we'd ever had a functional marriage. The grandchildren were the biggest challenge and the biggest joy. As they got older, I was able to have honest conversations with them about family dynamics, about the importance of treating people with respect, about the difference between helping someone and enabling them. Emma, now 9 years old, sometimes asked why I didn't live with her grandfather anymore, and I told her that sometimes grown-ups realize they're happier living apart while still caring about each other. Those children were learning to see me as a person with my own needs and boundaries, and they were becoming more thoughtful and considerate as a result. Instead of approaching me with demands and expectations, they approached with questions and requests. Instead of assuming my availability, they asked about my schedule and accepted when I had other plans. I was teaching them, through example, how to have relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. The most unexpected development came in September, when Dr. Rodriguez suggested I consider sharing my story with other women who might be struggling with similar family dynamics. The Senior Center had started a support group for women dealing with financial exploitation by adult children, and they needed someone to facilitate who had successfully set boundaries and rebuilt their life. The first meeting was just 5 women sitting in a circle in the center's community room, sharing stories that were heartbreakingly familiar. Elena, whose son had used her credit cards to accumulate $60,000 in debt. Patricia, whose daughter had moved back home temporarily 7 years ago and now treated her like hired help. Joyce, whose grandchildren she'd been financially supporting, had been taught to see her as an ATM rather than a person. Listening to their stories, offering the insight I'd gained through my own painful journey, helping them recognize the manipulation tactics that had kept me trapped for decades, It gave my experience meaning beyond my own healing. My years of being taken advantage of became the foundation for helping other women recognize their own worth. The hardest part, I told that first group, echoing Rose's words from a year earlier, is accepting that some people will only love you for what you provide, and once you stop providing it, you discover whether there was ever any real love there at all. But I also told them Rose's other lesson, that there are people in the world who can love you for who you are, not what you can do for them. People who see you as a whole person deserving of respect and consideration. The support group grew rapidly, word spreading through the community about a place where older women could talk honestly about being exploited by the people they loved most. We called ourselves the Worth It Group, and we met every Thursday at 2 o'clock, sharing stories, supporting each other through family guilt trips, and slowly learning to value ourselves. Many of the women couldn't take the dramatic steps I had taken, cutting off financial support, setting firm boundaries, accepting the possibility of damaged relationships. But even small steps toward self-respect made enormous differences in their lives. Learning to say, "Let me think about it," instead of automatically saying yes. Asking for time to consider financial requests, instead of immediately providing solutions. Setting one small boundary and maintaining it consistently. Each woman's journey was different, but the destination was the same. The recognition that they deserved to be treated with basic human dignity by the people who claimed to love them. 2 years after my transformation began, I can honestly say that I don't recognize the woman I was before. That woman seems like someone I knew long ago and felt sorry for. Someone who confused being used with being loved, who thought service without respect was meaningful, who believed that her value as a person was measured entirely by her usefulness to others. I wake up now in my small Manhattan apartment looking forward to my day, instead of dreading the requests and demands that might come. I make plans based on my own desires rather than other people's needs. I spend my money on things that bring me joy instead of solving other people's problems. I'm in a relationship with a man who values me, friendships with women who respect me, and family connections that, while not perfect, are no longer toxic. I've learned skills I never knew I had, developed interests I'd forgotten I enjoyed, and discovered a strength I didn't know I possessed. Most importantly, I've learned the difference between loving people and enabling them, between being helpful and being exploited, between family loyalty and financial manipulation. The woman writing this story is not the same woman who received that cruel text about the cruise 2 years ago. That woman was broken, exhausted, and desperate for scraps of appreciation from people who saw her as a resource. This woman is whole, energetic, and surrounded by people who see her as a person deserving of love and respect simply because she exists. The journey wasn't easy. Setting boundaries with people you love, accepting that some relationships were built on exploitation rather than genuine caring, learning to value yourself after decades of being devalued, none of that happens without pain. But on the other side of that pain is something beautiful. The recognition that you are worth more than what you can provide to others. You are worthy of love that doesn't come with conditions, respect that doesn't have to be earned through service, and relationships that nourish rather than drain you. To anyone listening to this story and recognizing parts of your own life in it, you deserve better. You deserve to be seen as a person, not a resource. You deserve relationships based on mutual care and respect, not one-sided giving and taking. You deserve to matter simply because you exist, not because of what you can do for others. And yes, setting boundaries might mean losing some relationships. But if someone can only love you for what you provide, was it ever really love at all? The cruise they couldn't miss was just the symbol of something much larger. The assumption that your needs, your health, your feelings matter less than their convenience, their desires, their priorities. When someone shows you that clearly how little you matter to them, believe them, but also believe in your own worth enough to demand better. Your life has value beyond your utility to others. Your happiness matters as much as anyone else's. Your needs deserve consideration. Your boundaries deserve respect, and your love should be treasured, not exploited. I'm 74 years old now, and I can honestly say these past 2 years have been the happiest of my adult life. Not because everything is perfect, but because I finally understand my own worth. Not because I'm surrounded by perfect people, but because I'm surrounded by people who see me as a person deserving of basic respect. The apartment where I once sat alone and feverish, reading cruel texts about missed cruises, is now filled with laughter and conversation and plans for tomorrow. The phone that once carried only requests and demands now rings with invitations and genuine care. The woman who once measured her worth by her ability to solve other people's problems now measures it by her capacity to live authentically and love herself. That transformation is available to anyone willing to take the terrifying, liberating step of valuing themselves enough to demand respect from others. You are worth it. You have always been worth it. The question isn't whether you deserve better. You do. The question is whether you're ready to believe it enough to insist on it. Have you ever lived something like this? Do you know someone who has sacrificed everything for family members who saw them only as a resource? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes just naming these patterns out loud is the first step toward changing them. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps ensure that messages like this reach other people who need to hear them, who need to know they're not alone, who need to understand that choosing self-respect over exploitation isn't selfish. It's necessary. Together, we can change these patterns. Together, we can learn to love ourselves enough to demand the respect we've always deserved.